That's the way.
Love the way Sean Gladding has written the story of God, the story of us, to help as a guide. And so we're using that guide as we tell the story. And today, our story with a woman named Hannah. Now, Hannah, like a lot of women in our story, was barren. She had no children. And as you might remember, a woman back in that age did not really belong to the family until she had a son. So this was a huge thing back then, even more than just the desire of a heart. And she prayed to God for a son. And she said if God would give her a son, she would devote that child to God. So God granted the longing of her heart and gave her a son whom she named Samuel. And when Samuel was 3 years old, she took him to the temple to be raised in the temple by Eli. Now, Eli was a wonderful priest. He was wise, he was faithful, and the things that he said needed to be written down in the Bible. Now, his sons, those things needed to be written in the National Enquirer. Wasn't so good, all right? But people were afraid. Hey, when Eli died, who was going to take over as the head priests there? And a man came to Eli, and God had pressed it upon his heart to tell Eli that actually his sons were not going to have that job description. God was going to raise up another. They didn't know who, but that's what it was. Now, the word of the Lord came to them one night. It was rare in those days, but it came one night while they were asleep.
It was well before dawn. The sanctuary light was still burning, and Samuel was still in bed in the temple of God, where the chest of God rested. Then God called out, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel answered, "Yes, I'm here." Then he ran to Eli, saying, "I heard you call. Here I am." Eli said, "I didn't call you. Go back to bed." And so he did. God called again, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli. "I heard you call. Here I am." Again Eli said, "Son, I didn't call you. Go back to bed." This all happened before Samuel knew God for himself. It was before the revelation of God had been given to him personally. God called again, "Samuel," the third time, and yet again Samuel got up and went to Eli. "Yes, I heard you call me. Here I am." That's when it dawned on Eli that God was calling the boy. So Eli directed Samuel, "Go back, lay down, and if the voice calls again, say, 'Speak, God, for I am your servant ready to listen.'" And Samuel returned to his bed. Then God came and stood before him exactly as before, calling out, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel answered, "Speak, I'm your servant, ready to listen." God said to Samuel, "Listen carefully. I'm getting ready to do something in Israel that is going to shake everybody up and get their attention. This time has come for me to bring down on Eli's family everything I warned him of. Every last word of it. I'm letting him know that the time is up. I'm bringing judgment on his family for good. He knew what was going on, that his sons were desecrating God's name in God's place, and he did nothing to stop them. This is my sentence on the family of Israel, of Eli. The evil of Eli's family can never be wiped out by sacrifice or by offering. Samuel stayed in bed until morning, and then he rose early, and he went about his duties, opening the doors of the sanctuary, but he dreaded having to tell the vision to Eli. But then Eli summoned Samuel. "Samuel, my son?" Samuel came running. "Yes, what can I do for you?" So Samuel told him, word for word. He held back nothing. Eli said, He is God. Let him do whatever he thinks best."
Well, Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and he became a prophet of God. Time passed, and once more the Philistines went to war with Israel. Now, the people of God had fallen back into their old ways, and instead of seeking God's guidance as to what they were doing, they decided to just go ahead and do what they wanted and maybe carry the ark along with them and call it good. Apparently, just carrying your Bible and doing what you please doesn't work real well. Go figure. Their army was decimated. The Philistines took that ark, and Eli's sons were killed. And when news of what happened came back to Eli, he collapsed and he died right there as a result. And the Philistines oppressed Israel from that day forward. Although, when they started to experience plagues like the Egyptians had, they did return the ark. It was 20 long years later that God directed Samuel to tell the people.
If you are truly serious about coming back to God, clean house. Get rid of the foreign gods and the fertility goddesses. Ground yourself firmly in God. Worship Him, and worship Him alone, and He'll save you from the Philistine oppression.
And the people did. And when the Philistines attacked, God delivered God's people from them. And Samuel placed a stone right there to mark their victory. And he raised it up, and he called it his Ebenezer, meaning, thus far, God has helped us. And so the Philistines were subdued, and they didn't trouble them for the rest of the time that Samuel led them. But when Samuel grew old, you think his kids learned? No. His sons started acting just like Eli's. They were taking bribes. They were perverting justice. And the elders of the people said, you know, you're getting a little old here and not sure about your sons leading us. We maybe don't need any judges anymore. We want to be like other nations. Give us a king. Well, Samuel was torn because he knew that his sons probably weren't the right ones to be the judges. But he also knew that in demanding a king, then they would be following a man instead of God. Instead of embracing their unique role as the people of God, they wanted to be like everybody else. Through Samuel, God warned the people that earthly kings are going to act like earthly kings, and eventually they would be enslaved. And yet they still wanted one. So God gave them the requirements for a king. First, that he be from among God's people, that he not build up a standing army, that he not enter into covenant treaties with other nations by marrying kings' daughters, or amass great wealth for himself. That way, they would continue to rely on God's protection and God's provision and be a witness to the other nations that God was indeed present in their midst. So they crowned their first king, the first king of Israel, and his name was Saul. Good job. You guys have heard this. Okay, all right. Saul, a handsome man. He stood head and shoulders among everybody else. Saul's first test came when the Ammonites besieged Jabesh Gilead, and in his first battle, he utterly decimated them. And that confirmed his reign. But governing them was going to be different and a little difficult because the 10 tribes up north were separated geographically from the 2 tribes in the south. So he had his work cut out. But guess what? Despite Samuel's warnings, Saul began to break God's commands repeatedly. So God sent Samuel to anoint a new king, a king that God chose. God sent Samuel to a man named Jesse from Bethlehem because he said one of his sons would surely be the next king. When Samuel arrived, he saw his oldest son, Eliab, and he thought, oh, surely this has got to be God's anointed. But the Lord spoke to Samuel and said, do not consider someone's appearance. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 7 of Jesse's sons came before him, and the Lord was silent. And Samuel didn't know what to do. He said, is that all you got? It is. It's right in the Bible. He said, okay. All right. And Jesse said, well, there is the youngest. He's out tending the sheep. and said, well, send for him. And so they sent for that youngest son, and when he came in, God spoke to Samuel and said, that is the one. And so Samuel took his horn of oil, and he anointed this young boy who would become king. And this young boy's name was David. David. Now Saul was still king, but he was tormented in his mind. And he asked if there was someone who could play the lyre, that would play music for him and soothe him. And somebody remembered that this kid in Bethlehem named David played the lyre. So they brought David to him, and he did. He played the lyre and soothed him. And Saul really liked this boy. And he would keep him around there, and he'd call for him from time to time to come on up. In fact, he even acted as his armor bearer for a while. But then, trouble. The Philistines, again, they challenged them. They gathered an army, and they had a champion who was 9.5 feet tall, and his name was? Close. Goliath. All right. Goliath. And Goliath came out every day to challenge the Israelites and to taunt them. Now, nobody would accept that challenge except David. You're right. Okay, Saul tried to dissuade David. He said, you're just a kid. This guy has been a warrior since he was your age. You can't do that. But David said, I can do this. I have defended my father's sheep. I was there when a lion came, when a bear came. In fact, he said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the claw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Well, what was Saul going to say? So he said, all right. And he gave him his armor. Well, David couldn't carry that armor. It was bigger than he was. And so he took the weapon of a shepherd, which was a slingshot. He took his slingshot, and David killed Goliath and gave them the victory over the Philistines. Now, at first, Saul was really pleased with that. But David got pretty popular, and he got a little bit jealous of this kid, right? And so David and Saul's son, Jonathan, became very close friends right about the time that Saul was growing pretty distant, so distant, in fact, from David that he decided to kill him. And he tried. David had to flee for his life. So he had to hide out. He hid out in the stones down by En-Gedi. Saul tried to hunt him down, turning his attention away from the Philistines, his real enemy, to his imagined enemy, David. Twice, David had an opportunity to kill Saul, but he refused because Saul was his king. And then, who do you suppose attacked? The Philistines. The Philistines attacked. Their chariots swept down on the armies of Israel, and they killed all before them. They killed Jonathan. They killed many of Saul's sons. Saul was mortally wounded, and he crawled away, and rather than being taken, he fell on his own sword. And that ended his life and his reign. And David, when he heard the news, grieved. Now that left a power vacuum. And so a lot of the generals tried to vie to see who was going to be in control. David went to the Lord in prayer. And God directed him to go south to Hebron. And so he did. And there they anointed him king in Judah. And he accepted that. Well, it wasn't too awful long before the leaders of all the other tribes came down, and they said, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who really led us. And they agreed that David was the one chosen by God, and they anointed him as their king. And David became the first king over a united Israel, all 12 tribes. Now, aware of the tension between the northern and the southern tribes, David needed to choose his capital very carefully. It needed to be right in the middle. It needed to be a place that had meaning to all of them. What was the capital that he chose? Do you know? City, you may have say what? Jerusalem. Jerusalem. The city of David. Jerusalem was the city that he chose. Now, when the Philistines heard that David had been made king over all of Israel, they assembled an entire army against him. David followed God's instructions exactly, however, and he destroyed the entire Philistine army and ridded the land of the Philistines the first time in 150 years. From then on, they would have peace. Now, having made Jerusalem the seat of his political power, David now made it the religious capital of the people, and by bringing the Ark of the Covenant there, David danced with joy as they brought that Ark of the Covenant in adoration of God. And there he worshiped, and he blessed the people. And Nathan prophesied to David in the name of God, "When your days are complete, I will raise up your descendants after you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. My chesed, my loving kindness," wish we had a word like that in English, "shall not depart from him, and your house and your kingdom shall be established forever." And so God renewed the covenant with David, promising God's forever presence would come through the house of David. Can you imagine being in exile in Babylon and hearing that? I mean, let's leave for a minute. When we started doing this, we said, well, let's imagine we're exiles hearing for this. They're in a foreign country. They are long ago in a galaxy far away, right? And they're wondering, what does this mean for me? And they hear these words, that there would be an anointed king sent from God to the house of David who would lead them back into a covenant relationship with God. Can you just hear these people sighing in exile? How long? How long must we wait for this one from God, for this Messiah who will bring us into a permanent, everlasting covenant with God? Who is this one who will be from the house of David? And how long must we wait? Well, let's go back to David. Truly, there never was a king like David. During his reign, he united the 12 tribes of Israel, and eventually the conquest of Canaan was complete. Jerusalem became the political and religious authority, and Israel the mightiest nation in the region. However, sometimes with power comes complacency. The following spring, when the Ammonites invaded from the north and they invaded Rabbah, David, instead of leading his troops into battle like a king should, hung back and just stayed in Jerusalem. And there he broke covenant with God with Bathsheba, which is a whole nother story. He committed adultery with this wife of one of his generals, Uriah the Hittite. And then he ordered Uriah killed so that he could cover up on his own sin. Well, you know, sin is just never a private thing. Nathan, the prophet, confronted David with his sin, and unlike all of the kings that would follow him, David repented of his sin, and he accepted the consequences for what he had done. And God forgave him. But because sin is not personal, it does affect others, whether we like to believe it or not. David's sin led to chaos in the kingdom. His own son, Absalom, tried to take the throne from him. As David's time grew near, he gave his son Solomon the charge to be faithful to the covenant that God had made with him. God had kept that covenant. Would Solomon, he had every reason to, king of United Nations, the 12 tribes, would he be faithful? Well, during Solomon's reign, Israel did enjoy 40 years of peace. They experienced great economic and political prosperity, and Solomon became pretty famous. He was renowned throughout the world. He was renowned as a man of wisdom, and he did collect and write the great body of literature of God's people, the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon, which you really don't want to give to your 12-year-old and under kids, okay? Just saying. All right. What he is remembered for most, though, is the building of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, that started out as a good thing, but he chose to do it using forced labor, which was not. He took on massive building projects, storage cities, garrisons, a huge palace for himself, much larger than the temple. And despite God's warning, he created a standing army, married the daughters of other kings, and entered into covenant relationship with them, and he amassed phenomenal personal wealth. Just about everything God had commanded the kings not to do. And in so doing, he was led away from serving the Lord. He did what was evil in God's sight. He ceased being what he was called to be. And the covenant that God made through Moses eventually became almost completely reversed under him, as the descendants of God's people in Egypt found themselves in virtual slavery to a king's building projects and a king's wishes. God's people had indeed become like all the other nations. You know, we wonder, what were they thinking? How could they let that happen? I mean, the things that God told them were so easy. Do we have problems with that? Well, maybe we should look around us. Are we wanting most to have the most? Are we seeing the pain around us, or are we causing pain around us? Is our religion static, one in which we see God's purpose as giving power to our desires and maintaining our standard of living? Are we silencing God's prophets when they speak words we don't want to hear? Do we participate in politics that oppress those that have the least? God's questions to the children of Israel are still God's questions to us today. Maybe we would do well to remember the Song of David and commit our hearts to remember that we are God's children and make it our song. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore me the joy of your salvation, and sustain me with a willing spirit. As we come together next week, we will hear the story of the division of a kingdom and the word of the prophets to a people in exile. Power plays. I would invite you to be there as we continue the story of God and the story of us. But right now, it's